So with performance health, as we've talked about, it covers a lot of aspects of the athlete's performance, and it does so when it integrates things like medicine, athletic training, physical therapy, strength and conditioning. So once that athlete finishes rehab and they're ready to return to participation, they still need to work on components of the training that are specific to their sport. So while all athletes generally can run, throw, or kick, they still need to refine those skills into what we call the sport specific training. And these would be things, these drills like designed for athletes that go beyond these basic things like speed and agility. We really need to get them to condition their body to perform those skills throughout the length of an event or a season of competition. And that's where this final phase of rehab and return to sport is really important. And that is to help support that specificity principle where we need the body to adapt specifically to the demands that's placed upon it. So this last phase in the rehab before they're fully returning to competition is generally supervised by a strength and conditioning coach, and sometimes other members of the performance health team may do it, like athletic trainers or sports physical therapists. And when we apply these to the athlete, we generally use kind of like an interval training approach, varying intensity and duration. And so you may hear things like an interval return to sport program or periodization training at this point in the return. But as you'll hear from our next guest, the term periodization doesn't just apply to rehab. It's actually an approach to strength and conditioning that's been around for quite a while. So Dan Lorenz is a physical therapist, athletic trainer, and a certified strength and conditioning specialist at Lawrence Memorial Hospital, where he is director of sports medicine. Dan was an assistant athletic trainer and physical therapist for the Kansas City Chiefs National Football League team, and was recognized by the National Strength and Conditioning Association as the 2018 Sports Medicine and Rehab Professional of the Year. And he's well known for his approach to strength and conditioning and the rehab of elite athletes, and has published numerous articles on strength and conditioning and rehab. Thanks for joining us today, Dan.
Thank you, Phil, for having me. It's a real privilege and honor to be here.
Thanks. So, I ask all of my podcast guests, particularly for students, how did you get to be where you are today? I think a lot of our students see where our guests have been, where they are, where they came from, but kind of what was that road, that path that led you to where you are now?
Okay, so from a PT and athletic training standpoint, like a lot of us, we played sports as kids, and I wanted to play professional sports. And yeah, I was 5 foot nothing, 100 nothing, right? So that wasn't happening for me, but I wanted to be involved in sports somehow. So like most, I suppose I got my start in athletic training. Freshman year of high school, actually, I reached out to, I'm from Chicago area, I reached out to the head athletic trainer from the Bears, just said, hey, how did you get to do what you're doing? And they were kind enough to invite me up to Hallis Hall where the Bears practice, and got to hang out in the training room, and they suggested go to the Kramer camps, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Phil.
Yeah.
Went to the Kramer camps, and I was planning on being an athletic trainer. And then high school, I broke my ankle, went through therapy. I'm like, wow, these are pretty closely related. But also at the same time, I was doing competitive powerlifting. So that really kind of got I kind of had all three of those areas, and it just made sense to me that, wow, if I do athletic training, I do PT, and I do strength conditioning, I will kind of cover the whole quote unquote alphabet of getting an athlete from injury all the way back to the field. So I felt like I had a good handle on the strength conditioning piece. I got my undergrad in athletic training, went to PT school, did some athletic training work at a high school while in PT school. Worked outside Chicago for a few years. And in 2004, I did the Duke University Sports PT Fellowship. From there, I went to the Chiefs position, and then I had my own practice for about 7 years. And then in the Kansas City area, and then right now I'm the director of sports medicine at LMH, or Lawrence Memorial Hospital in Ortho, Kansas, in Lawrence, Kansas. So I suppose that's maybe the 2-minute summary maybe of how I got to this point.
Yeah. That's again a long path, a lot of stops along the way. And yeah, I started a Kramer camp when I was in high school as well. I started in high school, did the same exact thing, and kind of felt that, except for the powerlifting, I don't think I ever did that. We shared a very similar path. So you've gone from the pro football to your own clinic to running a hospital sports medicine. That's a great variety of settings. So, today, tell me a little bit about kind of what your day looks like, or if you could do that like a week, what does that look like?
I still see patients.
Mhm.
I think the only director in our system that actually still sees patients. I was kind of I felt like it was important for me to be in the trenches
Right.
with my staff. I wanted to keep those skills up anyway. I enjoy treating. I didn't want to stop doing that. Certainly, it's a lot less than I used to do.
Hmm.
But I obviously oversee our outpatient sports medicine facility. We have several high schools that we contract with. So I oversee the athletic trainers, kind of help them with their day-to-day stuff if they need things ordered, or like we're updating our computer software system. So I'm kind of going through all that stuff, helping kind of with EAP or emergency action plans, those types of things. We have a concussion program that I'm a part of. I can't say I lead it, but I'm certainly a part of it. And then we have a strength conditioning piece. We had a performance training program here, which we were really growing and doing some really good things with. But our strength coach left to go get his master's degree overseas. So we're kind of in a holding pattern right now, what that program's going to be. But effectively, it's really nice. I'm able to kind of use all three of my fields that I feel like I have a handle on in every day of practice. So that's nice when you can use all the things that A, you enjoy, and B, that you're trained for. So.
That's great. So how, I spent a year with the Saints as well. Um, what's the difference in working with the athletes and at the NFL level versus what you're working with athletes today in a hospital system?
Well, I think at the professional level, I mean, that is their job. So they have the ability to rehab and train pretty much all day, every day, and do everything they need. They can get their therapy in, then they can go get their cryo, then they can go get their massage, then they can go get whatever other palliative and passive treatments they want to get themselves ready. Well, not all of our athletes have that ability, or frankly the funds to do that. Certainly at the professional level, you're dealing with, it's a business, right? So you're dealing with some of the nuances of agents and
Mhm.
contracts and things like that, which can make things a bit different. But also too, I think at every level you're dealing with, uh, there's always the ancillary stuff that goes along with it. So the high school level, maybe you're dealing with coaches and parents, maybe the pressure to get back because of the big scholarship. Whereas in the pros, you're dealing with media pressure and again, agents and handlers. My gosh, the higher level you go in sports, the more handlers and hangers on and the more people in these people's ears, right? So you got to deal with that stuff too. So I said that, a knee is a knee is a knee, right? It's just
Yeah.
the objectives at the end, and the process to get there is a little bit nuanced and different depending on who's in front of you.
Yeah, I think people need to realize it's every setting, everything is associated with other things. It's just different. So, like you said, I mean, it may be glamorous to think that you're on the sidelines of doing all these things, but you're going to have the same crap to deal with at that level to a certain degree as you would in another level. And it really comes down to, I think, what your passion really is.
Mhm.
For me, it wasn't necessarily working with these elite athletes because I never even went to a game. I didn't care about the game. What I cared about was making sure these guys got taken care of during the week. And my passion was working high school games on Friday nights because that's where you're getting kids off the street who otherwise may be out there doing things they shouldn't be doing, but they're playing football and they're doing it for free,
Mhm.
and no one is taking care of those. Years ago, we didn't have a bunch of athletic trainers covering, high school sports like we do today. So I felt that that was my passion that I really enjoyed doing.
Yeah, no, I love it when you get people back to doing what they're doing and seeing athletes get back in the field. I mean, that's the best.
Yeah.
And like you said, at the high school level, it's kind of at the most pure, right?
Hmm.
They're not being paid. They're not disgruntled because they're not a paid college athlete. They're not upping their play because it's a contract year in the sport, in the pro sports world, right? So no, I agree with you. You really have a chance to, all the connections I've made with kids that have gone on to PT, or some that even still reach out, were all high school and middle school kids that I had as patients. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that's the good stuff.
And we talked about a little bit earlier. doing things, volunteering your time are important aspects, not only to give back to like the profession, but you never know how that's going to build your career by being in the right place, the right time, because you decided you would go ahead and do things without having to worry about being paid every time that you did it. So volunteerism and mentoring and things like that, I think are really important to what we're trying to do.
I'll tell you, I use this example a lot. I have a former student of mine. He's really interested in soccer. He actually went to the college I graduated from PT school, and he volunteered and just kind of hung out with a major league soccer team, the one here in town in Kansas City, and he showed up for some events and just worked unpaid, did what he was supposed to do for them. And then lo and behold, they wanted to hire a PT, and I got a phone call. Hey, we were going to hire him. What do you think? Yeah. So I'm not saying it's going to happen for everybody, but sometimes you gotta go out and take it, right? And yeah, a lot of people aren't willing to do that. Right. Some people have different situations where they can't afford to do that. I understand, but that sometimes you have to lose to win, and there's a lot of situations out there like that. And I think sometimes it's just recognizing when that opportunity knocks, you got to walk through that door, right? Like, don't pass up on things if you get the shot.
So I think what we're talking about is we get back to the performance health team, and we've talked about this in other podcasts, that if you're in sports medicine or in performance health, you don't do it for the money and for the glory. That's not the right reason. It's really for the athlete. And if you can make that connection where you're helping that athlete and it makes you feel good and you're able to still make a living somehow, I think that's the important thing. It's not about being on the sideline going rah, rah, rah. I got my face on the camera. I work with all these fancy athletes and things. I think that when if you're looking for a member of a team, a performance health team, you don't necessarily want that type of person on your team because they're not doing it for the right reason.
Mm-hmm.
In my opinion.
I agree 100%.
So getting back to kind of what we were initially going to chat, we've already caught up quite a bit here as usual when you and I get together. Let's talk about this period of after rehab, before we're really fully back into competition. We've gone through our phases. We've gone through our rehab. We've done some speed drills, some agility drills. Now we're really trying to get very specific. Maybe this athlete's a little deconditioned. We want to get them back into the very specific stuff for their sport. And we talked about sport specificity. How important is it to make that transition? Can you just, throw someone back on the field after rehab? What do we have to do in terms of an athletic consideration for rehab there?
We can't throw them back in the field, but in the same vein, the only way to do sport specific stuff is to do the sport.
Yeah.
I admit, as a young clinician, I tried as best I could to quote unquote mimic what they had to do on the field, but you just can't.
Yeah.
You just cannot do it. They have to get back in the context of their sport where they have decision making, reacting to stimuli under specific context of the sport that they're in, right? So we can progress them. So we can take a basketball player that can do maybe some one-on-one, do 3v3 at half court before they do 5-on-5 full court, right? So that would be a sport specific progression. Mm-hmm. But I think it's important that we say that you don't need to do a lunge that looks like a backhand tennis serve for it to be sport specific, right? Like, you can do those things, that's fine, but understand that there's not a single controlled study that shows that doing a lunge that looks like a backhand gets any better outcomes in a tennis athlete than doing just regular lunges, right? So, right. It is important that from a sport specificity standpoint too, from energy system development. Like with football, the average play is about up to 7 seconds, with recovery time of a minute, 35 seconds to a minute ish. Whereas you get basketball where it's constant movement. They're sprinting every 21 seconds or so, based on a couple previous studies. Soccer has a mix of energy systems, so you really got to think about that too as you move people towards the later phases.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up a lot of the considerations are not just about strength. you have to take into consideration that cardiorespiratory, cardiovascular energy systems. And I want to go back to what you had said earlier about the lunge with a backhand. The thing that drives me nuts today is stuff that's on Instagram and all these weird exercises that people are making up and calling them quote unquote functional. And it's really gets back to the basics. I think we've lost that. Everyone wants to have these sexy moves and, oh, wow, that's really cool. Where do you think we've gone with that core of just the base strength, how important that is? And we've kind of veered off into that functional, sexy stuff on Instagram.
I think if Instagram and all that social media stuff goes away, so too does this. I think there's a direct correlation
Yeah.
to the circus acts we see on social media. You know, I've said a number of times, Phil, I say it to students when they come here. I say it when I've joked. A lot of people have pushed me to get on Instagram, and
Wouldn't be good enough.
No.
You're not going to have all that fancy stuff, man.
No, because you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to show a trap bar deadlift like for 12 consecutive days and just add like 10 pounds a day. Because I say all the time, my training programs are painfully boring. Because, you know, I'm just not certainly we do certain exercises to make things fun. Like, for example, you know, I'll use those, the strobe glasses in ACL rehab, or we'll use the VR stuff like roller coaster apps and things. Like, I'll do that stuff because there's some validity, you know, for the brain retraining.
Yeah.
But I mean, some of these circus acts you see people doing, I mean, it's just like, what are you really doing?
Yeah.
I push, we pull, we carry, you know, we get too cute. I squat, I deadlift, I lunge, we do step ups, we do step downs, we bench, we horizontal pull, we vertical pull, and we build from there. I guess I think if we dial that down to the basics aren't sexy, but they're darn effective.
You know, what's interesting, Dan, is I talked to Sue Falsoni on this similar topic. And one of the things that she said that was the most influential and helpful for her career in this realm was working with strength coaches. And your mentality is exactly that, of being that strength coach mentality that I think is missing between the PT and the AT, which, you know, a few of us have the CSCS. But really, and Andre Labe will tell you the same thing. It's when you get in the head of the strength coach that things start to make that bridge that gap a lot better. And what you just said, as I'm thinking about it, is, I mean, that is terminology that your typical PT, AT student, they really wouldn't necessarily understand a lot of that stuff. They may know what a step up is, but how do you integrate it into strength and conditioning? And that's the gap that we need to fill.
Well, and really, I got to tip my cap to George Davies on this. You know, he's this sage, right, for all of us. And he's like, you know, you really should, because when I rotated, you know, at Gunderson with him, and, you know, he said, you know, you really should start writing about this stuff. Because I felt like I had a decent handle on it just because of my strength and conditioning background. I spent some time and again volunteering, observing in some college weight rooms with Division I programs, and got a good handle on it. And like you said, it's important for us to speak the language when we talk to strength coaches as we transition people in the late phases. And I think a lot of therapists just struggle with that because Phil, you know this, we're made to be generalists in PT school, that you can come out and treat neuro, you can come out and treat peds and those kind of things. We're not trained to do late stage rehab where you're talking to strength coaches. Like, that's got to be something you kind of got to do on your own. It's almost like continuing ed, right? So that's really what I've tried to do in my own way, I suppose, is make this accessible information for PTs to understand.
And that's, again, I told you at the beginning, this is why I asked you to talk on this topic, because you are the guy that does that understands a lot of that stuff. So getting back to this concept of periodization, tell me what periodization is and why it's important. We need to talk about it.
Sure. Periodization really is just a fancy term for the planned manipulation of training variables throughout a training cycle. I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. It really came from the 70s and weightlifting. That's really what it was created for basically one competition a year. The early texts on this were Leo Matveyev. I would encourage you to look up him, Tudor Bompa. His text is really a classic.
Yeah.
Mel Siff, Super Training is another book that talks a lot about that stuff. It's really dense, so don't read it on a Friday night or whatever, or at the end of the day when you're tired. Just seminal text that I feel like you should have. But really what it is, like I said, is just manipulation of training variables. And there's lots of ways to go about it. There's lots of different designs. I think it's important to understand though, that it's not set in stone. Like it's not supposed to be that we do this exactly at this time, because every athlete will respond differently. Remember, the original program designs were for basically one weightlifting competition a year. Well, as we know, many of our athletes are multi-sport athletes. They have several games in a week. Some of them are playing sports that are in a sense diametrically opposed to each other. So what if you get a kid that's a baseball player who's also a football player? Like what if he's an offensive guard, but he also pitches? Well, there's going to be some different things you're going to do for that kid versus somebody that does just one sport. So hopefully that's the 1 minute summary of kind of what periodization is, but really it's just planning. It's planning and it's programming, that you have some structure and a forecasted plan rather than just being kind of more random with your program design.
And isn't it where you talked about that you're varying different aspects, and you may hear mesocycles and microcycles. What are those all about?
So microcycles are really kind of a weekly plan, and then mesocycles are kind of blocks. So if you're talking like if you look at, let's say a 12-week, let's just say 12 weeks arbitrarily, a 12-week cycle, the microcycle would be individual weeks or maybe 2-week blocks, but then your mesocycle would be maybe 2 months or 3 months of it, so a quarter of it, and then your macro would be the full year plan. That's, again, those are terms used in periodization literature and stuff. So that's where those terms come from.
And you mentioned it started with training and weightlifting. How does that transition into rehab? Can we use it in rehab?
Well, I think in a lot of ways, if you look at basically the three most commonly discussed forms of periodization, there's linear, which is really what we do in rehab. I mean, that's the process we follow. We kind of work on endurance. We do some hypertrophy work. We work on strength. Then we go to power, and it's systematic. It's progressive. It's sequential. There's the undulating or nonlinear, which is effectively you're doing kind of a heavy day, a light day, and a medium day in the same week. The idea there is that the variation. If we look at the principles of exercise prescription, it's progressive overload, variation, and specificity. Well, that's where the variation piece comes in with undulating. And then the other one is block. Block periodization is, there's lots of fancy terms like transmutation and things like that. But really what it is, there's just nuances in what they would do and how they train. So for example, complex training is a method where you do like a heavy resistance exercise followed by a plyometric exercise of a similar movement. So a back squat followed by box jumps or counter movement jumps. Well, in a block phase, like it's so specific and the blocks are so much shorter. So you're looking at maybe 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks max, that they would never do that type of training in a block program. So in a block program, you might fit an entire macro cycle in the course of a month, because the blocks are super, super, super specific to a specific training goal, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
So those are really the three main ways that they're done. And again, all it is programming. We don't want to periodization is a fancy term, but it's programming that we're not just frankly throwing darts at a board, right? Or having random workouts.
How does periodization then differ from like an interval return to sport program then?
Well, interval return to sport programs typically, your intent and like how hard, like the effort you're putting in tends to increase over time. So that's more of the linear part, right?
Mm-hmm.
The volume tends to increase over time, which typically if you're looking at a weight room, volume is high in the beginning, but then as we go to more higher intensity lifts, so heavier or more power type, like speed movements, we're dropping volume considerably. But in an interval sport progression, like a pitcher or a tennis athlete, or I have a professional volleyball player right now, she's towards the end of her return to volleyball, but the intensity and the volume are increasing because that's what she's going back to. So those are some of the nuanced differences between like a weight room progression versus an interval sport progression.
Gotcha. So when we talk about these sport specificity activities, and I love the circus analogy, what do we look for when we talk about sport specific? So it's not just the movement, right? Let's talk about, and you mentioned earlier, the metabolic demand. So how do we wrap everything into sport specificity when we're looking at how do we make the best sport specific activity, looking at the whole picture?
I read a study literally yesterday that talked about counter movement jumps versus depth jumps, so box to floor in volleyball players, and what increased their vertical jump more. In this particular study, the counter movement jumps did it better than the depth jumps because it matched exactly what they have to do on the court.
Right.
So that's really where the specificity comes in. So if I have a basketball player, if I have a volleyball player, because they're more vertically oriented athletes, I'm going to have a more biased training program to vertically oriented activities. So back squats, front squats, deadlifts, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if I have a more horizontal athlete that's like a sprinter, maybe a hockey player, I might mix in some more of those horizontally driven activities versus more vertical. Not say they don't need vertical. It's just that's really where you're dialing down to that's the sport specificity that we're talking about here. Not
Right.
that you have a lunge that looks like a backhand or a lunge that looks like a pitch.
That's awesome. So you mentioned you're staying very on top of the literature, and we talked about your journal club, and I know it's a little bit off topic, but why is research so important to you on a daily basis, and how do you use it in your practice?
I always say that research informs but doesn't dictate my practice. As you well know, Phil, and you're far better at this than I am, even despite all the reading, I still struggle with the stats. And, every time we do a journal club, somebody brings up something that I didn't catch. We as clinicians, and one of the issues I've always had with the people that are driven by just the research is that, well, you know what? I don't have an exclusion criteria. I got to see who's in front of me. I don't have, as a clinician, you don't have that luxury.
Yeah.
And it's a joke that's used a lot, but it's like, well, we don't have a randomized controlled trial for everything, right? It's, that you've heard it before, and it's a bit of a cliche, but is there a randomized controlled trial saying that parachutes are effective? I mean, right. I mean, it's used a lot, but it illustrates the point that we can't have an RCT for everything.
Right.
However, it's really important to keep up with, what we know works and what we need to make sure that it's in our programs. If I read a study and it confirms what I already know, well, that means I'm keeping up. If I read a study where like yesterday, we read a study in our journal club on moderate versus heavy loading on patellar tendinopathy. It was a really, really well done study. And my bias, and I admit it, my bias has always been heavier and slow. I came up in the late 90s and early 2000s where it was sexy to do eccentrics all day, every day, right?
Yeah.
And I admit, hey, 20 years of practice, that's what I said, 20 years of practice, I've seen it work a lot. But what this study showed me yesterday was that they did moderate. Now, you can question how they loaded, for sure, but the moderate load group did just as good as the heavy load group. So what that told me is that, and I've done this, I've frankly pissed off a lot of tendons previously because I went too heavy too soon for somebody that wasn't prepared for those kind of loads. So what this tells us is that on somebody that maybe is deconditioned, maybe somebody doesn't have a good training history, maybe somebody that's just not an athlete or doesn't have a lot of athletic background, I can still get a good outcome with moderate loads. I don't have to crush them with high loads.
Right.
Right. So I think that's kind of what reviewing the research does. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of it. And hey, like I said, there's been times I read a study and I'm thinking, oh, okay, I got some good information from this. And then somebody who's really like that has a PhD or somebody that is really well versed in the stats will say the stats on this are garbage, blah, blah, blah. And then you kind of, your tail goes between your legs because here you thought there's something you could glean from a study, which I think that is a challenge for most clinicians. In fact, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but in fact, like Terry Grindstaff at Creighton. Terry is such a great guy, and we've done a course together where we did word salad. Trying to translate research terms to practice for the average clinician. Because and you and I've talked about this, Phil.
Mhm.
Heck, you're always my go-to guy, Phil. What does this mean? What on earth is a Bonferroni correction? Why should I care as a therapist, right? How does this affect my day to day? And I
Right.
think that's where most therapists kind of look at research and like, I don't care. Just show me the systematic review or the meta-analysis. Give me the summary, right? They don't want to get into the weeds. So I really went off on a tangent there. I'm sorry, but hopefully that's kind of my position on research.
No, that's my passion. If yours is powerlifting, mine is research and statistics. Just because I don't know as much as I want to know, and I've been working on my own to try and learn. I'd see, like you said, the word salad. I'll look up a Bonferroni correction and I'll go like, what is that? And then I'll go and find what that is and I'll research it myself. Because I didn't spend a lot of time in PT school or even in my PhD program learning a bunch of statistics. You have to for your PhD, but what I found was in statistics, and we'll go off tangent just a little bit because you started this. The problem is people use those words and don't understand, and they get intimidated. And I presented on this at Combined Sections, the last live one that we had. And what I found is these words are very intimidating. And what you do is you gloss through them. You don't understand them. You just trust the fact that these are correct. And what's happened, as we've talked about, is that shoddy stats are getting through the review process because not everyone is a statistician that's a reviewer. And so after the fact, people then start questioning these types of things. And it leads up to a problem that we have in research, which is p-hacking, which is trying to make things look significant to get your p-value at that less than 0.05. And I'm at a point where I cannot stand the word significance because it doesn't mean that the treatment was effective. Significance only means and it doesn't mean that it was significant. No, it means that the researcher, I'm 95% sure that the researcher correctly rejected the null hypothesis. It's a yes or no answer to a question. It's not how effective was the treatment. It's how sure are we that the researcher made the right decision about the hypothesis. So we should just get rid of p-values for the most part from a clinical standpoint, focusing on things like confidence intervals, effect sizes. But then I've got to teach people, well, how do you interpret the confidence intervals and the effect sizes in a clinical setting? And that's where the gap is, I think, in clinical statistics, is getting away from these traditional, petri dish p-values and getting us to the more practical confidence intervals, effect sizes, and things like that.
I couldn't agree more, man. I think if we had the ability to do that, I think a lot of clinicians wouldn't be so intimidated by research.
And well, we have to start with the researchers and start getting rid of these p-values and use confidence intervals. And just real quick, I hate you started this. A confidence interval will actually tell you if the p is less than 0.05. If your null value is included within your confidence interval, it's a non-significant outcome. So you don't even have to report your p-values anymore. Just look at the confidence interval and look for the null value. And if it's there, then it's not significant statistically. Okay, last question. And again, off topic as we like to do, but you just published something on blood flow restriction. And I just, in the 60 seconds, can you recap? I know that's a hot topic and you're on top of all this. What's your take home message on that?
Well, take home message is take a look at it. As I wrote in the article that, so many of the things we do in our field, the science behind it is weak. I mean, every week there's a new modality, there's the new thing that's going to change everything, right? And the science behind it, the theory is shoddy and very speculative at best. But people swear by it, right? Well, with blood flow restriction, we have years, decades of really good science. Now we don't know all the answers, but we still have really good science, clinical studies on it. It is a nice treatment adjunct. I try to say not a replacement. In this particular article in IJSPT, everybody wants to use a shiny new toy, so they want to use it for anybody and everyone at every time, and it's not what it's for. It's not to replace our current training methodologies, but as an adjunct, and it's a really, really nice tool. So spend some time educating yourself on it and the mechanisms. There's always safety concerns with that. Make sure you're aware of those. Make sure of your individual state regulatory statutes, what you can and can't do. It requires a discussion with probably your legal team and administrators. You don't need a certification.
Right.
You don't need a fancy, you don't need to spend a gazillion dollars. There's lots of good units out there all across for the budget. So it shouldn't be something that only for the elite, right? Or only
Right.
for the people with deep pockets. But take a look at it. It's worth your time.
Well, thanks a lot, Dan. This has been fantastic. So real quick, social media, you still busy on Twitter?
Gosh, a little bit. Just not a joyful place. So I don't know, man. I'm on there a little bit. I try and post, but it's hard because it's just I just would rather spend my time doing other things. And people say all the time to get on Instagram. I'd rather be with my kids. I'd rather be reading books. It's just not important to me. It's just not. I don't know what to say. And I know I'd probably teach a lot more and have a bigger following and those kind of things if I did, but cheesy as it sounds, it's just not important to me. So I do it a little bit I do enjoy the engagement. I really do with the PTs, but you got to go through all the stuff, which really wears on, admittedly. And that's hard to do.
The trolls.
I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Instagram.
Well,
but I'll happily answer an email or a phone call anytime. Reach out on Twitter, KC Rehab Expert.
Casey,
where there's a will, there's a way you can find me, because people found each other before all this happened. So if you really want to talk to me, you can find me. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, we use stamps, envelopes. That's the way we used to communicate.
Yeah, and I know people don't do those things very much anymore, but like I said, man, I think the more of us that get away from that, I think everything gets a heck of a lot better. So I'll get off my soapbox on that topic, but it's not helping being on that stuff. So.
Well, I know that I was just gonna give you a plug for your Twitter handle in case people want to follow, because I've always enjoyed keeping up with the literature with what you post.
Yeah.
And I know that you don't necessarily, get into it as some people, but I find that Twitter is a good aggregator to stay on top of new stuff. And you're one of the guys that I like to follow with what's new, what's out there. And
I agree. That's the best of Twitter, 100%.
Yep. And that's the only reason why I use it.
Right. There's people that I wouldn't have access to. I reached out to about their articles. I scroll for those people's articles, right? Yep. They release them ahead of time. I mean, that is what I use it for. I don't get into all the other stuff, but yeah, it is. Like I said, interacting with people overseas that I've never met that are experts in their field. I mean, that is the best part of this, I think. And where, again, sometimes the good stuff gets lost in all the garbage, right? So I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll keep posting articles. I find I used to do it a lot more than what I do now.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Same. All right, buddy. I appreciate your time today. This has been another awesome experience. So we appreciate you taking the time today.
Hey, thank you, Phil. And thanks for asking me. I know you had a litany of people you could have asked.
Stop.
So I hope people find that our discussion was worthy of their time today. So
I know they will. Thanks, everyone. You guys have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
All right. See you, Phil.